Clinton leaves office in 2001, we have to elect a new president. Clinton can't run again because presidents are limited to 2 terms, obviously, even though he's very popular. And so Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, will run for the Democrats. The Republicans will nominate Texas Governor George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. And the election will be unbelievably close. Both will run as centrist. Both will kind of move to the center and promise to continue on Clinton's legacy of economic prosperity. And the big argument is over the surplus. Remember, we're now taking more in government revenue and tax revenue than we are in than we're spending in government programs. Al Gore suggests that we should continue to run the surplus, and we should pay down debt, and we should shore up Social Security to make sure Social Security will last for generations ahead. George Bush argues that the surplus is the people's money and should be returned to the people, and promises, if he's elected, to send every taxpayer a check for $600, which is curious in light of the panic the Republicans are going to express over the increasing debt in later years. This would have been a great time to start to pay some of that debt down. In Congress, the Republicans maintain control of the House, but only by 5 congressmen. And the Senate is split straight down the middle 50-50, which means the presidency will decide who controls the Senate because the vice president will cast the tie-breaking vote. What it will come down to is Florida. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but the Florida election was crazy. There's episodes all over Florida of confusing and properly printed ballots, and people being denied the chance to vote. And we will have electoral chaos. It'll take 5 weeks to determine who's going to be the next president. Al Gore will demand a recount, but only of certain counties. George Bush will move to try to use the legislature to block that recount. Bush's brother is the governor of Florida. The whole thing is a crazy mess. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, in what's really a shocking legal move, will take on the case about whether or not the recounts can continue. This is shocking because elections are state-run things. There is no such thing as a federal election. That is one run by the federal government. So this is the Supreme Court inserting itself into the state's process. And what's particularly interesting is it is the conservatives who have now been talking about states' rights for 50 years who are going to move in and trample all over states' rights here. They're going to enter they're going to hand down the Bush v. Gore 2000 decision and order that the recount be stopped. Now, most Supreme Court decisions are issued stare decisis, meaning that that becomes a precedent for all future cases. But this case is curiously issued non-stare decisis, which many people take as an indication that it was a political and not so much a legal decision. We've actually had one of the 5 justices, it was a 5-4 decision, who voted for Bush recently come out and say that the court probably shouldn't have taken the case. But nonetheless, George Bush becomes president, not so much on the people's vote, but on the vote of the Supreme Court. It's important to point out that the state was later recounted. Media organizations paid to recount the entire state of Florida, and in fact, Gore had won the state. But nonetheless, we have President George W. Bush. He begins right away facing questions of legitimacy and competence. Bush was widely perceived, right or wrong, as perhaps maybe not being the brightest man ever to sit in the White House. He pushes through enormous tax cuts. He justifies this by pointing to the surplus. He says, well, we're taking in more money than we're spending, so we're going to give huge tax cuts, particularly to the wealthiest people in America, corporations and people making more than $200,000 a year. This will cost us $1.35 trillion over the next decade, and will become the major driver of the spiraling budget deficits that will continue through Bush's presidency and into Obama's. Bush had run by saying he was going to be a uniter, not a divider. But immediately when he gets elected, in fact, before he even becomes elected with this controversial election, Bush becomes one of the most divisive presidents in American history. When Bush goes to run for re-election in 2004, his top political advisor, Karl Rove, recommends that he run on social issues because he's not terribly popular when it comes to foreign policy or the economy. States, many swing states, Republicans in swing states, will put on the ballots in those states state measures on gay rights, on gay marriage, in a hope to drive out socially conservative voters who will show up to vote against gay rights and then also cast a ballot for the president while they're there. Under President Bush, the assault weapons ban expires. This had been passed by the Congress under Clinton and signed by Clinton, but it was only passed for a limited amount of time, and it expires and assault weapons become illegal again. Another key issue for conservatives. A constitutional ban on gay marriage is proposed in Congress but fails to pass. And the Republicans focus on cut issues, issues that will drive out more of their voters than their opponents. Bush prohibits stem cell research, claiming that it is dangerous to fetus. This is part of the anti-abortion movement. And in fact, abortion becomes a major issue in American politics, as many conservative candidates return repeatedly to the abortion issue to try to drive out their voters. Bush, who is evangelical, will openly appeal to evangelical voters. And we know now that in the 2004 election, Bush, like Nixon, abused the federal bureaucracy to try to get himself elected. Karl Rove was going around to basically every federal government agency and lecturing them on how they could use their agency to make sure Republicans win the election. Bush wins the 2004 election against his opponent, a decorated war hero, John Kerry, mainly by beating the Democrats in the turnout game, getting more Republican voters to show up to the polls than Democrats. Bush, who received fewer votes in the 2000 election than his opponent and barely beats John Kerry in the 2004 election, will claim that he has a mandate from the American people to enforce his policy agenda. And he begins his second term by going after Social Security. He wants to privatize Social Security, take it away from being a giant pool of money that pays out to anybody who's over 65, and turn it into individual privatized accounts. He demands more tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America. And of course, he continues the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.